So I guess we've talked a bit about the moral responsibility of government towards its own country, but I want to ask about how morally responsible should governments be for citizens outside of their own country. So, for instance, citizens in other countries that have been affected by the government, by one government's colonialism or imperialism. How morally responsible would that government be?
Um, okay. It is totally our fault that it's like so okay, all of the developed countries currently have gotten to where they are by being imperialist nations. And now that um we have all of this power, it is our responsibility to try and help these nations that we shoved into the dirt so long ago and currently still are. Um, I don't remember who said it, but there was this one person that said, Mexico is rich, Nigeria is rich, the islands in the Caribbean are rich. We took those resources and made them poor. Um, that's not exactly what he said, but it was a commentary on imperialism, how we took everything away from those countries and made them quote unquote third world. We pushed them there. Now
Mhm.
it is our responsibility to bring them back up. It's, disgusting that we have this divide of first world, third world. So I like to use the language of developed and developing. It's
Mhm.
still awful because, what is developed? I mean, there are these little tribes in jungles. They're fine. They don't have
Yeah.
cell phones, but they're doing just fine. Um,
Yeah.
but
Sorry, just to
yeah,
speak on what you were saying there. I've actually had a lot of like thoughts about that as well in when I was doing like comparative politics. It developed suggests there's a point to reach, like that we've had like a finished growth point, and that's like kind of the end goal that we need to reach, and that everyone else who's developing is just trying to get to that point, which is
yeah,
like it's very Western and it's like it's very biased, and it also implies that what we're doing
totally.
right now is it's perfect.
Which is such so not it.
Yeah, it's very not true. But disregarding that language, we also can't forget that the reason why other countries are quote unquote behind um, is because of us.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I would argue we have moral responsibilities to them. But and I'm almost tempted to say this is a hypothetical because what country haven't we, in some way pushed down? But but for a country that we haven't negatively affected versus a country that actually, sorry, for a country that we haven't negatively affected, um, but they still require our assistance. Do our governments have a moral responsibility to help them?
If we have the resources and someone needs help, we should share it.
Mhm.
Period.
I completely agree with you, but just to make things interesting, I kind of want to play devil's advocate here. Um, so government's primary purpose is to its citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if potentially those resources could be making our citizens' great lives even better, why should we share them if our primary function is solely to our citizens?
If our people are covered and we've got excess, ship it off.
Okay. Um, but then I think we talked about this earlier actually. Universal basic income, where some countries have tried giving their people some form of basic income. It's contingent on some things like job, age, stuff like that. Uh, but that requires a lot of resources. So, and it was kind of shown to be a pretty effective system when it was implemented in some countries. Uh, why would we want, like, there, my point is when mentioning this is we can always make the citizens' lives under us better. Um, so why would we insist on, uh, I guess, shipping off our resources if our responsibility is to our citizens?
Okay, well, if we're being literal, the United States is one of the richest countries in the world.
Mhm.
And, um, we have a lot of money. Um, so we could, uh, I mean, this seems like a really odd way to ask this question. I mean, there's always extra. Like, I mean, it sucks that okay, the United States, first of all, it hasn't really covered all of its citizens. I mean, there are
Mhm.
people starving in the United States, which is such like that shouldn't happen, but we're one of the biggest food wasters. Um,
Yeah, I can actually kind of answer my own question here a little if you want. Because I kind of take a utilitarian um, perspective on it, where I kind of believe that I'm not a huge fan of this idea of the nation, of like nation states, where I think that wherever the money can go, where it will benefit the most amount of people, that's kind of where the money should be going. Sure, we have like a base. Sure, there's the basic responsibility to the citizens to make sure um, they're satisfied. But at a certain point, I think the money that we have would be better used for other nations um, in general. That's my perspective on it, though. I'm not sure if you would you agree with that or.
I don't know. That sounds like we already discussed, like talked about this. I mean, because like if we have the resources and our people, like I've said it before and I'll say it again, if we have the resources, our people are taken care of, and someone needs the help, we should send what we have to help those people.
Mhm. The difference was from what I was saying was that um, our people will like never be fully taken care of because there's not really, I would argue there's not really like a limit to that. But I think I do think at a certain stage others will need it more. So that's for citizens outside of the government. But I'd like to kind of return to citizens inside that government's responsibilities. So my final question is, how morally responsible is the government for the success of the individual? And success is a kind of vague word. So there's a few metrics I could go by. So for instance, in a more like general term, how responsible would the government be for an individual citizen's quality of life in your perspective?
Okay, quality of life. A lot of that has to do with privilege. Um, like, okay, for example, um, neighborhoods that have larger volumes of people of color usually are about 5 degrees hotter in Fahrenheit than those with white people because of the amount of trees in the area. And no, I cannot cite a study for this. I can't remember anything.
No worries.
So my apologies. Um, yeah, but like I can see that in my own experiences. Like we have this really rich neighborhood in our area called Hillsborough, which is just a lot of the big mansions, and it is covered in trees, this area. So it's really pleasant, even in the hottest days of the year, to walk outside because there's always shade.
Mm,
Then
yeah.
we have the flats of Redwood City, which there are almost no trees or very little, and it is brutal to walk to school from your house in that area, and walk from it in the afternoon with that sun beating down on you. And it's really, puts a damper on trying to do anything because it's just so much. An issue like that is really due to redlining, which has, taken a hit to the Black, Indigenous, and people of color quality of life in the United States because it, removed the economic wealth from those areas and to better support, white supremacy in society. So the government has had a big hand in that. And then, of course, everything that we have done to remove the land from the indigenous population. The government, that's what we were built on, was taking away the quality of life from other people
Yeah.
and allocating it to the white patriarchal society that we have today.
Yep. But that like raises an interesting point though, is that would you agree that the government responsibility for something like quality of life would shift from depending on like who that person is? So, for instance, if someone was like someone POC had a very high quality of life, I would argue that they had more a higher responsibility for their quality of life because they had to push through systems that were kind of against them. Whereas for me, if I have a higher quality of life, that's more on the government's responsibility side because they built the systems that would benefit me. Would you agree with that?
I guess I really don't know enough about that to give a
Okay,
fully informed opinion.
fair enough. Yeah, it just seems like you're pointing out that the way we've like made systems or the government has made systems in the past um, has a bearing depending on who you are. So so if the government's more, I guess, morally responsible for a lower quality of life for one group of people, um, then it then it might be the other way for a different group. Anyway, so but that's just one, right? So I think this would have kind of similar arguments, but you had some interesting points about employment when we were discussing earlier about the government's moral responsibility for that.
Yeah. So like 60% of the transgender population is unemployed, and that is due to the transphobia. No one wants to hire a trans person. Um, so whose fault is that? Well, I think it's society and the government's fault for not doing anything to help trans people and spread the word that we're not going to bite you.
So I guess my one question I had for you is the government ever completely responsible for the success of an individual? So like considering all those factors I mentioned earlier, do you believe that the government would ever be um, like solely responsible um, for the success, or I guess I hate this word, but failure?
The government is responsible for the systems that um, make someone more privileged automatically for any reason. And it's responsible for the systems that remove rights from someone else automatically. Um, and, you know, whatever building blocks or whatever it took to get to someone's success, I mean, a lot of it's okay, that's just a really hard question to answer because there are so many different layers to someone's success.
Mm.
And I know we're just trying to start about the government, but a lot of it does have to do with privilege. And like in um Scandal, the show Scandal, the main character's father, you have to work twice as hard. Oh, but if you don't know the show Scandal, the main character is a Black woman played by Kerry Washington, our queen of the screen. Um, and I don't know a lot about the show, but I do know this quote was that her father said in terms of, Black Americans trying to get to where white Americans are, you have to work twice as hard to get half of what they get.
Mm.
And it's the government's fault that we have that system in place. And I don't really know how else to go from there.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with you. Um, from a personal perspective, and this is also probably a pretty privileged perspective, I don't think the government is ever responsible for 100% of like a person's success. Um, but I do believe that the government can place very, very significant roadblocks in front of people, and in the way that it creates systems against them, as you pointed out.
I feel like I forgot to address before talking about a lot of these subjects with I acknowledge my privilege. I grew up in Silicon Valley as a middle class, upper middle class white person, and I do not have any experience of the prejudices that Black, Indigenous people of color face. So everything I talk about is based off of stuff that I've read, class discussions, and I understand that my opinion is not the most valid because I literally do not know what's what. I'm just a kid from Silicon Valley.
Yeah, same for me as well. I'm not originally from Silicon Valley, but pretty much everything else is the same. I'm very privileged. I haven't had any of the experience, and at this point, I guess I can speak for both of us on this one. It's very much just conjecture about some of the stuff we're talking about, and from what we've read and what we've heard and what we've seen. But yeah, disclaimer. Well, with that last bit said, I want to hear what you guys think. So let me know in the comments below what you believe the moral responsibilities of government would be. Um, and let us know what you think about some of the stuff we've discussed. What do you think would be the moral responsibilities of the government for citizens outside of the government, for citizens within the government? How responsible should a government be for the success of its citizens? What's the functions of government, and what's the primary function of government? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And also, thank you so much, Mac, for joining me. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. I hope this gets as successful as you want it to be.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Um, well, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.